pleasure of introducing our presenter, my colleague, Jill Robertson. Jill is a landscape architect. We won't hold it against her. She's based in Edmonton and she's a principal of Dialogue. She has a wealth of experience in landscape architecture and planning, from detailed site design to visionary master planning and city building. She's led a variety of multidisciplinary project teams across Canada, the US, and internationally. Jill understands the strategic advantages of a truly collaborative design process, a skilled facilitator of design-oriented public engagement. She's known for her ability to achieve meaningful consensus in highly sensitive situations. Her work is widely recognized for her ability to weave context specificity into a design narrative that celebrates the story of how people use her spaces. Her peers have recognized Jill as one of Canada's emerging landscape architectural leaders, and in 2018 she was recognized as one of Edmonton's top 40 under 40. Her work has been recently honored by the National Urban Design Awards and the Canadian Institute of Planners. Jill wanted to be a landscape architect since she was 12, when she learned about it at a program at the University of Calgary. It appealed to her that she got to draw pretty pictures, and she's very good at that, but also make the world better. That's what she gets to do every day: come to work and create spaces for people to enjoy that hopefully make our world lovelier, sustainable, inclusive, and welcoming. For every project that Jill's involved in, she brings energy, enthusiasm, passion, and a strong desire to impact meaningful change. And I think you will get a good sense of that about Jill in her presentation. So I now welcome Jill.
Well, thank you so much, Kate, for that excellent and some of it marketing written, as many people are consultants here, introduction. Super excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen. I anticipate a very conversational, as much as we can through Zoom presentation. So if you have questions or want to interrupt me or have a chat, let's do so. I think that'll make it more fun. So I'm going to share my screen. So everyone knows why we're here. We're going to talk about the chicken and egg dilemma of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And this is a really interesting topic that is particularly topical now with all that's going on in the world, but also for me personally and where I'm at in my career. And I actually sit on a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force as part of the Global Design Alliance, which is an organization that Dialogue is a member of. And we recently held a similar, more of a conversation, and that was sort of the nuggets for this talk. So I'm looking forward to sharing my thoughts with you. And please, I certainly hope that you will interrupt at any time. So I like to start every talk with a disclaimer. First of all, I'm not a diversity, inclusion, and equity expert. As Kate said, I'm a landscape architect. I don't work in HR, so there's a slight chance I will be politically incorrect. I'm also definitely a feminist first, an urbanist second, and a landscape architect third. And so everything that I say needs to be taken in that context. So consider yourselves fully warned. So the goal for today is to share ideas, to build some capacity around issues relevant to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ultimately make the world better. And as designers, I really feel that this is our social responsibility. We have been given a unique tool set and opportunity to change the world, and that's why I'm passionate about landscape architecture, and that's why I think that this conversation about equity in design is particularly relevant and particularly timely. So this is my daughter. This picture is a few years old now, but I love this photo. She's standing at the end of one of my favorite projects, the Mechanized River Valley Access in the city of Edmonton. And she looks like she's about to take on the world. And this is why this conversation is so important to me, because I want to leave the world and the space that we as women in particular occupy in this world a little bit better for her. So when I talk about diversity, it will definitely be through the lens of gender, because I experience the world as a woman. And I put in this image in particular, Dial Down the Feminism, after I was called out by one of my male colleagues at Dialogue about having a feminist agenda. And so it's become a little bit of my mantra, and you'll certainly see flavors of that today as we go through this conversation. So diversity, inclusion, and equity. I mean, first of all, we need a new acronym. This is a really a terrible way to start a conversation, but the issues that we're going to touch on today are so important. And I want to start by saying that all of the topics around this are highly sensitive, highly political. And so I approach it through my own very specific lens of being a white, university-educated Canadian woman. So in terms of privilege, which I'll talk about in a little bit in the conversation, I'm at the top, but I definitely feel that gender is a huge facet of my professional life and my professional practice. And so everything that I talk about will be through that lens. But one of the first things I think that we need to talk about is coming up with a different acronym. And if you Google diversity, equity, and inclusion, actually most companies talk about it and have a different type of acronym, but I thought this was kind of a funny way to start. So we definitely don't want to focus on that acronym specifically. So why is this relevant? Well, as designers, we have an incredible opportunity to shape the world, both the public and the private realm, specifically through architecture and landscape architecture. And the design of our cities and the buildings and the spaces that we occupy has an incredible impact on our lives. We sleep in buildings that have been designed by an architect. We walk down streets and go through open spaces that have been designed by landscape architects. And yet, so many of those spaces are designed by such a small group of people. In fact, if you think about it, the people that are most impacted by the design of the spaces are often the people that have the least opportunity to contribute to that design or have the ability to shape those design directions. And so that's why this is particularly topical and I think relevant. And this quote is from an organization called Design Justice. And if you're not familiar with them, I'd suggest Googling them after the presentation, obviously, because they talk about and advocate for the ability that we have as designers and the role that design has in promoting social equity. So what's the plan for today? We're going to go through a bit of a vocabulary just to talk about some of the definitions. Then I'm going to share some different scenarios about the challenges of achieving kind of a circle of inclusion, equity, and diversity, and then hopefully have a Zoom facilitated discussion. Before I move on, I'm just going to ask if anyone has any questions or anyone wants to say anything, and hope that Kate may be able to facilitate that.
I can read out if any questions pop up. So guys, you can type it either in the Q&A or in the chat at the bottom.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. So let's start with a vocabulary lesson, because these diversity, equity, inclusion are actually very broad terms. So it turns out if you Google diversity, you can hit on an immense array of clip art, some of it kind of interesting and some of it pretty stereotypical. But what does it actually mean? This is the Merriam-Webster definition of diversity, and it speaks to variety, the inclusion of different types of people, specifically in this context, races or cultures, in groups or organizations. And then the second piece is an instance of being composed of differing elements or qualities, a diversity of opinion or a diversity of thought. Equity is the second term I want to touch on, and again, super stereotypical and cheesy clip art. I think one of the most interesting conversations that I've had of late is helping people understand the difference between equality and equity. And this is a graphic probably many of you have seen, but I think it really demonstrates that. And in my experience as a woman in this industry, I found that we talk a lot about equity, but we're really thinking about equality. and equity is very different. And so we need to be considering equity, because sometimes people who don't look like the stereotypical architect in the room need additional support to have the same opportunities. And so that's a really important distinction that I find is often overlooked, and many people focus on equality instead. And again, our trusty online dictionary talks about equity as justice according to natural law or right, so freedom from bias or favoritism, and again, something that is equitable. And the last definition is inclusion. And inclusion was actually more challenging to get some cheesy clip art, so I'm going to skip that and go right to the definition. And so it was the act of being included, and that I think is important. So the act or practice of including and accommodating people who have historically been excluded because of race, gender, sexuality, ability, etc., etc. So inclusion is this idea that everybody has the right to participate or have a voice in decisions. And again, I'm going to link it back to design consistently. And as citizens that live in our cities or in our towns, I believe that everybody has the right to be involved or the opportunity to share their ideas on the design of those spaces for people. So this is a really important principle, I think, from a design perspective. So in terms of how these all fit together, they're not separate principles, they link together, but they're also not mutually exclusive. So inclusion, thoughts, ideas, and perspectives of all individuals matter. Equity, constantly and consistently recognizing and redistributing power so that it's not just one person having the voice all the time. And then diversity, multiple identities represented in a single organization. So when these all go together, you end up with this idea of belonging. And in the context of an organization, whether it be a firm, a community group, a city, a country, belonging is a state where it engages and recognizes the full potential of the individual. And it's in this space that innovation and creativity linger. You need to have all three of these happening at once. We often talk about them as separate ideas, and that's where this original idea of the chicken and the egg came from. What happens when you have diversity without inclusion or equity, or vice versa? And how do you end up achieving the state of belonging where all three parameters overlap? So before I go forward, are there any sort of questions or comments or reactions to this?
Yes, there is one question from Azin. She's asking, why do you think, oh, sorry, wait,
Sorry, I just sent her a message asking whether,
yeah, no, it's
I think
okay.
Jill just answered it.
I found it, but I'm going to read it out loud anyways. She has asked, why do you think it's a chicken and egg dilemma? What's the chicken and what's the egg here? It sounds more like you are saying EDI is a dilemma.
Yeah, what I'm saying by that is that which comes first, and I'll talk more about that when we get into kind of the scenarios, but in an organization specifically, if you focus on diversity without equity or inclusion, are you limiting yourself? Like, how do you kind of balance which of these areas to focus on? Because it seems to be hard for firms, and again, I work for a private consulting company, so this is all through that kind of lens. It's hard to achieve all of those at the same time. So that's sort of the nexus of the chicken and the egg dilemma. And so this is actually from medium.com. So there's a really interesting article that I'm referencing in a lot of this conversation. So if you're interested, I would suggest Googling that, but at the end of the presentation. So we don't want to just talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. There's actually a number of other facets that are relevant to this conversation, and I hope will kind of spark the essence of our conversation going forward. So the first is tokenism. And this is something that one of my American colleagues on the GDA talked a lot about. And this idea of making a symbolic effort to give the appearance of equity. And I think that it's relevant. It's certainly relevant from my own experience when I became a principal at Dialogue, because a lot of the conversation was, well, was I promoted because I was a woman, or was I promoted because I was the best person in the room for the job? And so I think as women in particular, we're very sensitive to tokenism, because we always want to think that the best person gets the job, the position, the opportunity, but also, you know, who defines what that best is. So kind of building on that idea of tokenism is this notion of privilege. And I talked a little bit about that at the beginning. And this is a quote that I really love from a book that I also really love by Glennon Doyle. And if you haven't read it, again, at the end of the presentation, go to Chapters and order it online. It's Untamed. But she defines privilege in this way that I think is really clear. So privilege is the idea of being born on third base. And I'm not a sports person, but I do like the sports analogy. Ignorant privilege is thinking that you're there because you hit a triple, and malicious privilege is complaining that those starving outside the ballpark aren't waiting patiently enough. So I find that privilege comes into the conversation when we talk about merit, especially in the context of promoting people at the firm. So at a firm or in an organization or creating diversity. Well, we're trying to get the best people, and, you know, are the best people just happen to be, you know, men or white men or whomever, insert stereotype now. And what I think the people that sometimes host that conversation don't recognize is their own privilege. And a great example of this is something that Kate said in my introduction. I was in the top 40 under 40 in Edmonton in 2018. And recently I saw a tweet and it talked about, you know, if you looked at top 40 lists and took away people who went to university, whose parents paid for their university, whose parents helped them buy their first house, how many of those people would still be in that list? And that to me illustrates privilege. And by the way, I wouldn't be on that list.
Jill, you've got a question. Do you want me to read it, or?
Yes, please.
There's somebody asking, can you give an example for how an organization can have belonging?
I will get to that. So whoever asked that question, that's a great question. Hold that thought.
Thank you.
And so the last, so building on the idea of privilege and tokenism is this idea of affirmative action. And this is a specific policy that has existed in the US. So I'm carrying this over from my US colleagues, but it's something we see in Canada as positive discrimination. And what it is it's that a policy that favors those who suffer from discrimination. And this is a very sensitive and spicy topic, but I think it's important to understand. And it's a bit of a two-sided coin. One side is providing opportunity for those that don't have privilege, but the second side of that coin is around that idea of merit, and do those people actually deserve to be in the room? And I think going forward, I don't have the answer to what is the best aspect of that coin, but I think it's important that we are cognizant of sort of both sides of those arguments, especially because, again, as women, and I'm assuming most of the people attending are women, we're really going to suffer from sort of consideration that we may not necessarily always deserve to be there. And then, of course, speaking of who deserves to be in the room, a big part of this is unconscious bias. And I think certainly in my own organization at Dialogue, it's not 1940. It's not where people are thinking that the women should be outside in cute sweaters typing and the men are making the big decisions. A lot of this comes from unconscious bias. And unconscious bias is a social stereotype. It's part of our primal brain programming. So if you look into brain chemistry and understanding, unconscious bias comes from the part of the brain that helps us make quick snap decisions. And and that's from the fight or flight part of our biology when we needed to be able to make those. And unconscious bias informs everything we do throughout our lives all the time. So I have unconscious bias, you have unconscious bias. It's something that we all have to deal with. And the best antidote for unconscious bias is actually diversity, and specifically diversity of thought, because we all hold these unconscious beliefs and they inform the decisions that we make every day. There's a number of very specific types of unconscious bias. One that Kate and I talked about early in the day today is actually affinity bias, where we favor people that we share qualities with. So if you're the senior principal architect and you need someone to do a quick sketch for you, there's probably 2 or 3 people that you always tend to go to. And it just may happen that they're always men. And that's a good example of affinity bias, because like attracts like, and it's easy for people to relate to people that are like them. The challenge is in an organization where you don't have diversity in the leadership, like promotes like, and you see that continual pattern of the same type of person advancing. It's also something that we see happen in hiring, disguised as we hire for cultural fit. Well, who decides what cultural fit is? Whenever you hear that, that's often a sign of affinity bias, because that means we're hiring for people that look, feel, think like us. Obviously, gender bias is a big one, but I think halo and the horn bias are ones that I've seen where people focus on either a specific negative facet of someone or a specific positive facet of someone in the context of their suitability for any given work. So again, these aren't things that are intentional. These are things that are hardwired into our DNA. And so the best antidote for them is actually conversation, awareness, and diversity at the table. And so again, some of these come up as comments like, well, I don't want to be hired, or I don't want to be promoted just because I am Indigenous, just because I am a woman, just because I have blue eyes. And then I always hear, this is my favorite one in the context of engineering. Well, there just isn't a talent pipeline. There aren't any female engineers to hire. And this was actually just in the news the other day, where I think it was the CEO of Wells Fargo Bank in the US said, there just aren't any talented Black people to hire in their organization. So again, that's a classic example of unconscious, well, in that case, it may be conscious bias. Whoops, going the wrong way. Does affirmative action even work? And this is a conversation I recently engaged in my own organization about not so much affirmative action, but its counterpart, the meritocracy. And well, should we set a standard for how many women are on a governance committee? Because then we may not be picking the most talented people. We really should be focusing on hiring for talent and not setting any standards for diversity or equity. And again, that goes back to this idea of, well, we only hire the best, and sometimes the best happen to just be white dudes. I love this one. As a leader in an organization, is it even our responsibility to be concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Shouldn't we just be focused on doing our work? This is also something I hear from design colleagues. Well, it's not really our job to be designing spaces for social equity or inclusion or diversity. We're just hired to do specific design. And the last is, again, and I spoke about this earlier, well, we always look for cultural fit or cultural alignment. And again, that notion of culture is often the enemy of diversity. So before we go into some of these scenarios, and this will get to that idea of the chicken and the egg, are there any questions?
Yes, there are. I was just waiting for you to finish this section. Okay, so there is actually a long question. I'm not sure if it's a question. Let me read it out for you. In our studio, we've discussed a version of affirmative action as a way to bring people of diversity into the office and promoting those within the office. However, this can be divisive and excluding to people who do not fit the description of what is diverse. Is there another way to bring diversity into the studio? Sorry, there was no question mark. That's why I wasn't sure if it's a question. Yeah.
That's the really hard challenge, and I don't know that there's an answer. I think in my opinion only, the benefit of affirmative action is it sets targets. It helps us move the needle. Ultimately, we want an organization or a world that is inclusive of all people, but if you don't set the bar and you don't create metrics for that, I think it's really hard. And so that's why policies like affirmative action are actually beneficial, because they help create equity and equal opportunity for people to get where they want to go.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. Cynthia has asked, when you talk about making sure the best person gets the job, how do you make sure that your pool of candidates is diverse, inclusive, and equal?
That's a super hard question, and we have had a lot of debate about that. There's different ideas on this, and I'm not sure I know the best answer. One of the solutions that I've seen is sort of blind hiring, where a person's name and gender are excluded. In the conversation I had around this, it was with a number of American colleagues, and they have different rules about the information that we can collect on people in the hiring process. But oftentimes, can you send a candidate's CV through to the hiring manager without including their name? Because that names tend to give people away. So that's one option. The other, and I think something that we have started doing at Dialogue, is just having a diversity of voices at the table in a hiring process. So it's not just, in my case particular, like 2 female landscape architects trying to hire landscape architects, because we're probably not going to hit the diversity of thought. So do you have different people screening? Do you have a series of questions that are consistent in interviews to kind of weed out that bias? And then do you have a range of people who are interviewing candidates to kind of hit that diversity of thought or inclusion in a hiring process? But that one is tricky. And that's where you find that, well, we hire for cultural fit. That's the enemy of an inclusive hiring process.
Thank you, Jill. That was all the questions that was posted so far.
Okay, so I want to talk about 3 different scenarios now, and then a little bit of a 4th one for fun, and then we're going to flip into a discussion. So the first scenario is, I think, something that we all, I'm going to assume we all enjoy as women. So imagine this is the boardroom. It could be a construction site. It could be the client's office, but it's sort of a singular demographic around the table. And it could be anything. I think in my experience, in my personal career experience, the demographic in this scenario happens to be the white man. But, assuming that key decisions are made around a boardroom table and drive policy, design decisions, hiring, public sector, it's really important. In this example, you have equity, because likely all of these guys have the same voice at that boardroom table. Everyone has a seat at the table, and they're all included, but there's no diversity. So if you are a company of all white men, not that that would ever happen, but it does, and all your customers are only white men, and every policy and decision only impacts white men, you're set. But without diversity at the table, no new perspectives are heard. There's less chance for innovation. There's less chance for creativity. what happens is that policies and design decisions are established and maintained that benefit the interests of those that have the power in the room. So one of the challenges in this scenario is that organizations can lose their competitive edge because they're not innovating, because they've created a culture that rewards the status quo. And often in this type of organization, people that are diverse or have diverse voices will leave because there's not opportunity for them to get a seat at the table. So this one is the one that we kind of jokingly refer to as the so many white guys scenario. And so without diversity at the table, you get essentially an oversaturation of groupthink, similar thought, culture, and ideology, and it ends up leading to a simplification of points of view. So scenario 2, I think, is actually really interesting. Scenario 2 is the one where you have diversity and inclusion. And so you have the opportunity for innovation, for progressive change, for advocacy. So this is a picture of the students in Parkland County, Florida, when they were protesting for gun control after the school shooting. So if you look at this picture, it's incredibly racially diverse. It's not maybe age because high school, but this is a safe space for students to advocate for change. However, in this demographic, none of these people have power. They don't have equity. They don't have the ability to influence the leadership at the state, at the national level. And so they don't actually represent a diversity of community because they don't have the sort of socio-economic diversity and the diversity of power. So what ends up happening is that there's great passion and excitement for change, but no real change happens because these people aren't at the table. They don't have the ability to have voices, and you end up with a power struggle. And so without that idea of equity, you end up that the dominant group or ideology controls the discourse regardless of what the conversations are. And then the last one, I think, is probably the most disconcerting of the three, and it's probably the most common that people in this Zoom room have experienced. And this is the idea of no inclusion. So this is where you have equity and diversity, but no ability to change the conversation. So I picked this picture of the classic man mansplaining things to us. And I think this is something I've personally experienced where I hear you, but you're actually wrong. Or if I could play devil's advocate for a minute, or actually, you know, the client, I talked to him about it and he said X. Like, this is the idea of erasure and minimization of voices in the room. So I hear you, but I don't value what you have to say. You're in the room, but stay in the corner, stay small, and don't talk. So you get to sit around the table, you get to share your ideas, but you're not actually considered one of the power brokers. You're not really a peer in the room. So I think that this is one that many of us have probably experienced, and it's subtle and it's damaging. And because of this, again, you see that people leave organizations or they don't advocate for change because they don't feel like they truly belong. So I found this kind of infographic, and it speaks to me because it talks about a woman of color. And recently Dialogue held a series of conversations following the Black Lives Movement in the US. So we were talking about just diversity and race and gender. And I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who's a landscape architect. She has the same years of practice, and we often do the same work. And when we're lucky, we get to do it at the same time in the same room. And I am so conscious of being often the only woman in the room. And she said to me following one of these conversations that she's so conscious that she's the only Black woman in the room. And the difference between how I am treated and how she is treated is so stark. And to me, it was really shocking because I think of myself as a good ally, and I think of myself as someone who's trying to be educated about these, and I'd never thought about that perspective. And so I put this kind of process in because I think it speaks to some of the scenarios that I just talked about. And so you have a woman of color who joins an organization, and it's a wonderfully diverse organization because they have women at the leadership table. But what actually often happens, and it's the scenario of my friend at Dialogue, is that the woman of color becomes the poster child for diversity. And a lot of the work to educate, to build capacity, to inform people about discrimination falls on that person of color. And they get, frankly, really, you get tired of being that person. Women don't need to be on diversity task force about gender. We know what it's like to be discriminated against. People of color shouldn't be the ones who are always talking about white privilege. We need to have inclusive conversations. And in this process, this is exactly what happens. And eventually the woman of color leaves the organization. So when we talk about diversity or equity, inclusion without the other two sort of partners, we end up in scenarios that end up helping encourage people to leave, not creating spaces that are safe, welcoming, authentic, allow people to be who they truly are. And that's how you avoid that place of belonging. And to the earlier question, you really need to work on focusing on all three of those aspects to make sure that people feel like they have a safe space to come to work and do their best work.
Jill, there is a lot of questions around this topics that you were talking about. Shall I go ahead and read them?
Yes, we're at the conversation slide.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna skip the names because some people are talking about their companies and I just want to, give the confidentiality. So somebody's saying, in my company, we do have quite a bit of diversity within our staff, but it doesn't filter up to the senior leadership team. I feel that there is a sense from the leadership that they feel good about that diversity and don't see the lack of diversity at the top. Any suggestions on how to bring that to their attention in a way they can hear it?
Wait, this is a safe space, right? Is that person talking about Dialogue? No, just kidding. It's a common problem. And just to be really factual, if you look at the staff complement of Dialogue, and this is public information, we have about 50-50 gender split between our staff. If you move up to the associate level, which is the next level of our organization, it's about 2/3 men, 1/3 women. And if you go up to the partnership level, of 50 partners, there are 8 women. So that's about 20%. So similar kind of demographics to that to the organization that this person is talking about. So I think the best way to do that, to raise attention, is to point it out. And it's challenging if you don't have a seat at the table, if you don't have the voice in the room. And so can you do it through finding allies who are either do have the seat at the table? Bringing data and statistics is a great way. In my organization, there's about 50% sort of design-oriented professionals and 50% engineers. And the engineers want to see metrics. They want to see statistics. So, engaging our HR department to help pull market data about demographic diversity is really helpful. And then just encouraging the conversation. I think when I started at Dialogue, this idea of diversity and inclusion wasn't a topic at all. And now it is, so much so that we actually just recently completed an audit of our gender diversity at the partnership level. But it wasn't without sort of obstacles. And one of my partners was the one that spoke about my feminist agenda, and it was specifically in raising this issue. So if it's going to be a fight that you want to take on, you just have to know that it's going to be challenging, but the best thing to do is continue to shine the light on it. Because I think it's really important for people who are starting in a firm to be able to look at leaders in their organization and see themselves there, to know that people of color, people of sexual orientation diversity, people of diversity of thought can all make it to, that there's a path to growth in that organization.
Okay, thank you, Jill. I'm gonna go to the next question. And sorry, in between, I'm just gonna say that some people are typing in the chat, and I can see that they are not questions, but if you wanna send it to everybody, you're just sending it to the panelists, not to all the attendees. Okay, so next question is, how do you think individuals can present their EDI characteristics without getting too personal and opening up in a hiring context that might not be trusting, in brackets, yet, and yet their experience and therefore perspective can be incredibly valuable?
Can I ask a follow-up? Is that in the context of like being a candidate and applying for a job? Can that person quickly type back?
Can you type that? I think it's Ira, if I'm reading it correctly. Can you type it in the chat? Oh, she's saying yes.
Yeah. So the first question I would ask is, do you want to work at a firm that doesn't value your diversity or the different skills that you bring? So that's maybe something to consider for you. But I think the best thing to do is to just be your authentic self and make sure that you're talking about your strengths and the attributes that you bring to an organization. One of the things that I've observed in hiring candidates to work with me is that, and again, I'm going to stick to gender, men are always like, of course I can do that. And women tend to be like, well, I think I can do that. I think go into an interview, be really confident about who you are, what you bring to the table, and why you're awesome. And if they don't hire you, that's not the right culture for you. And, there's moments to be the person that moves the mountain, and there's moments that are not. And maybe this isn't your moment to move that mountain and challenge that, but go find somewhere that will respect and value the skills that you're bringing to the table.
Thank you, Jill. So the next question is, visual diversity seems to be the most important or only considered type of diversity there is. There are some things missing in the sentence. How do you look or become aware of other types of diversity?
So to this, I always think about diversity of thought, and this is what I tell my partners at Dialogue. Visual diversity is the easiest because we can see it. I've got blue eyes, I have kind of a pandemic blonde, brown, gray hairdo going. I can tell that my friend Cynthia has blonde hair. Like, those are obvious. I know if someone has black hair, those are obvious distinctions. And so it makes it really easy. Diversity of thought is harder to see. And so I constantly reminding people about it, being aware of our unconscious biases is really important. And then actually going through unconscious bias training, I think, is really helpful, because I've done a series of that types of training, and it helps just make you more aware of how many different aspects there are to the human experience and how those shape who we want to hire. Because especially in Canada, we can't ask those questions. It's actually protected under Canadian law. You can't ask someone what their sexual orientation is, what their ethnic diversity is, what their age is. But we want as much breadth and depth of that as possible in an organization. And so the best way to do that is through diversity of thought. But then, specifically in the context of hiring, having two people who are very different in an interview, because everyone comes with their different biases. So often, I'll sit in with an engineer when we're trying to hire an architect, because everybody in that room has a very different sort of preconceived ideas, and that helps sort of weed out some of that unconscious bias.
Okay.
Because chances are, if you have two white guys and who are doing the hiring, and a white man candidate and a female candidate, the white guy's going to get the job always, because like hires for like, unless you're being very deliberate in your attempts to combat that bias.
Thank you, Jill. Okay, so the next question is about scenario 3. Why do we say equity is there? Can you go back to the slide?
Sure. So equity is there because you have that range of people who have a seat at the table. In this scenario, there's quite a bit of diversity, and everyone gets their chance to have a say. So that's the piece of equity, is that if it was me in this scenario, that guy is asking me what I want, so I have the equitable opportunity to share my opinion, but there's no inclusion because it's not valued. So that's kind of the piece of that, is that you can have the chance to sit at the table, make your recommendation, but you're not actually part of the clique that makes the decision.
Okay, and then the same person has sent a message, which is, because I read it before, it's not a question. I'm gonna just quickly say that it's a research done that she has sent, and I can at the end send it in the chat, Jolly, so everybody can see it. And I'm just gonna skip that one.
I think she's actually already included it in the chat as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think in the chat it was only for the panelists, though. That's, yeah. Okay, so the next question is that a question? A seat at the table. Yes, it is. Okay. A seat at the table. How is this to be accomplished in firms like Dialogue when the strata of partners, associates, staff is often generational? Principals, partners are the ones that have liability for the work. At my firm, 35 to 40 people, very diverse staff, less diverse staff associates, even less diverse partners. Many firms are not large enough to even have these types of roles, just a principal and some staff.
That's a complicated question. I think, I'm going to come at it from two sides. Part of how I think in my own journey I got to the partner table was just working pretty freaking hard, and oftentimes harder than the equivalent man in the room. And I've worked at 3 firms in my career, and each time I started with a male kind of equivalent and ended up being promoted over him, but after working really freaking hard, and then subsequently that man left that organization. I don't think that's the right answer. That was my own experience. The right answer is that for the people then who get to the leadership table to turn around and extend their hand and create a pipeline for people coming behind them through mentorship. And one thing that I've also observed in my time in a leadership role is that there's sort of 2 scenarios of leaders, the ones that reach behind them and help the people that are coming up. And the second is that sort of pull up the ladder mentality. Well, it was really hard for me to get here, so I'm going to make it really hard for you to get here too. And ironically, I actually think that women sometimes are the most guilty of that, where I struggled so hard. I was the first woman at the table, so I paved the way for you, so I'm not going to make it any easier for you. And so I think when you do have the chance to be at that leadership table, it really is important to look behind you, to create space, to create mentorship opportunities, and specifically for people that don't think or act like you. And if you're in that organization and you want to get to that table, and you don't see a path, have that conversation with your boss or your mentor and say, like, I really want to be here. I really want to be a partner. What are you looking for? What do you need? And how can I help you get there without changing who you are, but understanding what they want and helping the 2 of you build that kind of mutual understanding of how you can get there.
Thank you so much, Jill. I'll go to the next one. As someone who hires, what is your favorite question to draw of a candidate diversity of thought?
I always ask people, what do they know about dialogue and why do they want to work there? Because I find that if people haven't done some research about why they want to work at dialogue, that's really telling. And also I think it's really interesting because people come to organizations with lots of different reasons. And I've had people say, like they just want a job, or they like the work that we do, or they want to work with person X. Like, I just think that's a really good open-ended question. And, in my own journey to be a better ally, and I'm going to talk about allyship in a second, I used to start interviews when I first started hiring people, and I would go in there and hire based on my gut or based on that idea of cultural fit. And I thought that this idea of scored interviews and set questions was really corporate and anti-creativity and anti-establishment. And I've actually learned that it's really important to have set questions and a set process so that you are setting up interview processes for success. So now I work really closely with our HR team to set questions that still kind of fit my flavor and what I'm looking for, but also promote fairness and equity in a hiring situation.
What is the, sorry, a question came up for me. So what would it be besides the question of why do you want to work at Dialogue? What do you mean by questions such as things that bring up equity?
Why I used to just have more sort of conversations. Now we ask people to talk about their strengths, talk about their weaknesses. I get people to take me through a design portfolio, and I kind of ask what they did, what they didn't do, what their contributions were. It's a bit more regimented. And then I always interview with someone else, and we actually have the questions on paper and we write down answers to them. And then we can sit and compare notes. And again, it takes away that idea of culture, and it helps mitigate my own unconscious bias. And since doing so, it's changed the diversity of the team. And I think I have a stronger and more robust team.
That's great to hear. Okay, thank you, Jill. So the next question. In our workplace, people usually socialize or gather based on race, example, white people, Asians, etc. Sometimes some people receive some key company decision simply because they socialize with the partners, mostly white. How do we get the culture mingle and no one feels superior?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I actually think that whole kind of thing is bullshit, to be honest, because I've seen it happen where, when I started at Dialogue, I had small kids, so I had to go, and my husband was working remotely in another part of the country, and I had to go home right after work and pick them up. And I saw the people that would go out for beers with the boss getting information and different opportunities. And so I think if you're in a leadership position, trying to create a diversity of events and social opportunities is really important. So it's not just beers after work, knowing that might not work for parents. So can you do coffee talks? Can you do lunch things? We just at Dialogue today we have these events called TGITs, like thank goodness it's Thursday and it's a monthly social. But this one was the Food Network, and my kids got on Zoom and taught the other kids in the organization how to make a cake because, to try and reach out to some of the family-oriented people. So that's a good way of doing it if you're in a leadership role. If you are not in the leadership role, making those opportunities for yourself. And again, it's not fair. I don't think you should have to do it, but until your bosses develop a bit more social sensitivity, you may have to. So saying, hey, can we go for a coffee during the day? I'd really like to tell you about my idea for X, or I'd really like to pick your brain about Y, but I can't go for beers after work because of this. So sometimes being proactive and finding those opportunities for yourself is the best way forward.
Thank you, Jill. Okay, so the next, I understand, thanks. Okay, so that's just thank you. Okay, next one. How does one have a further conversation when somebody points out that you are not a cultural fit? Is it time to leave or question further for self-improvement? It seems like a lost battle. And then there is a second question to that, which is being nice at a workplace considered an asset, but sometimes seems fake? So the first one
really
was
good.
self-improvement and
Well, without, I think that the person that asked that question, I think you need to do some deep thinking. I mean, you have to ask yourself if that's an organization that you really see yourself fitting in the long term. If it was me, I would try to unpack and potentially, try to drill into, well, what do you mean by cultural fit? Like, what are you looking for in cultural fit? Why would you think I'm not a good cultural fit? To try to understand if it is truly sort of a more holistic culture of your organization, or that notion of culture being a monoculture. And so I think that's something that you need to kind of dig into a little bit, and then figure out if you want to try to stay and change the culture, or you want to move somewhere else and find somewhere that's more culturally aligned. And the slide I have up now, kind of talking about this question of culture, is that these are all subjective attributes of any organization, and it's going to be different everywhere you go. And so you have to figure out, do you want to stay and make change in your own organization to suit kind of your taste, or do you want to go somewhere else where potentially it's more culturally aligned? And I think that's something that every individual has to ask themselves. And it's not a static answer. It changes all the time. I've definitely decided to stay at Dialogue and help change the culture, but there are many days where I go, what the heck am I doing? So it's an ongoing debate.
okay. So let's go to the next one. What do you think a hiring model to tackle the lack of representation would look like? Is there a way to measure belonging?
Yeah, there is for sure. And that goes back to that idea of affirmative action. And so setting targets for diversity. So looking at the demographics in your organization, identifying where there are diversity gaps, and then setting specific metrics to meet those gaps. And so a great example is, if you look at the demographics of architecture school graduating classes, it tends to be 50-50. Well, what does it look like after registration? Is it still 50-50? In your organization, is your staff complement of architects 50-50? When do the women start leaving the workforce? And then what do you need to do then to set that target? So, oftentimes it goes from staff to associate to partner. So do you need to set a target that 50% of promotions to associates are going to be women? Do you need to set a target that 50% of associates are going to be people of color? Like, whatever that target is to address this specific gap that you're aware of. And it is going to be contentious, because the argument that the people of privilege often use to this is, well, then we're not hiring the best people. But until you set targets, there's no way to ever measure change, and there's no way to advance diversity in a truly measurable way in an organization. And then oftentimes, if you really start to unpack it, it goes back to the notion of, well, there is no pipeline. And, our 50% of women going into first year engineering, or like, if you look at a first year engineering class, are 50% of those people women? Do you need to go back to high school to create an environment? Like, do we need to, as members of a professional organization, to create a scholarship for Indigenous architecture students or people of color? Like, there's things that we can do within our professional organizations to, again, to create opportunities for equity and to level that playing field so people have the opportunity to get there. But I really think until the world changes, we need specific targets to set goals.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, our firm has a hiring policy of gender balance and ethnic diversity, and we have achieved this among our staff. What is an effective way to extend this to the partner level, given the societal barriers women face around long working hours and financial risk partners face?
Again, I think around the long working hours, you know, conversations about that, and I see a little bit of a societal shift in that. I think that 10 years ago, the notion of productivity was measured by hours spent in your seat at work. I actually hope that the pandemic and forcing all of us to work remotely will be the biggest step forward in demonstrating that your productivity is not equal to the number of hours you spend in your chair. And you don't need to be physically present in your studio to kick ass at your job. The second piece to that is internal leadership and development programs need to also set targets. So we have a program called Build Dialogue, a dialogue. We like to use our name a lot at Dialogue in our initiatives. And it is supposed to have a target of 50-50 gender diversity. So again, the people that we're saying we're developing as leaders, you know, we're investing equally in those targets, again, to try and level the playing field at higher levels of the organization. And then sometimes, and again, this is really unfair, but this is my experience, you just have to put your elbows out and say, you know what, screw you guys, I'm a working mom, I have to go pick my kids up at daycare, it's 4:30, it sucks, deal with it. Because I've seen it where the dad gets celebrated for being a great father because he's taking the afternoon off to go to his kid's kindergarten concert, but if I walk out of a meeting to pick up a sick kid, I don't care about my career. But I've also seen that attitude change in our clients. And now my clients are the same as me, and they're diverse, and they expect diversity, and they understand diversity as well. So I think that's actually one of the biggest also drivers of change, is the fact that our clients are changing as well. And they're not interested in the old white boys smoking cigars in the boardroom model either. So the last time I got a phone call in the middle of a presentation that I had a sick kid at school, the client offered to drive me to go get him because he said he's been there. So that was a pretty nice moment.
That's very nice. Okay, I believe the next question, Jola, you wrote that you got your answer for what's the best course of action when you witness an act of sexism in the workplace, especially when the act is done by the boss. Time to leave. And then you wrote, I got my answer. Did you mean to this question or? Okay, well, maybe we can answer it, but she's not answering back.
Okay, that's a really hard question. You know, I think if you witness an act of sexism and it doesn't happen to you, you need to speak up. We need, the next slide actually I'll go to is this idea of allyship, and we need to support each other. And so if you see it happen, you have to say something. And it's really, really, really hard. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say that it's easy. Even in where I sit in my level of practice, it's really hard to be that person. And if it happens to you, it's awful. But the only way that we can make change is to talk about it. And so recently I saw it happen to a female partner of mine, and I didn't say anything in the moment, and I felt awful after. And so what I actually did is call one of my male partners and say, you know, you were in the room when this happened. I didn't say anything. I feel terrible. You didn't say anything. Like, we need to support each other to be allies and make sure that that behavior isn't tolerated. When a similar situation happened to me, and I walked into a boardroom of 18 men, all in suits, and the super big major client of the firm made a wildly inappropriate comment about my physical appearance, I sat there in shame, and it was awful. But afterwards, and nobody said anything. But afterwards, I talked to my partners who were in the room, who didn't say anything, who knew it was a wrong comment. And I said, I need you guys also, when that happens, to be able to say something, because when you're that person and you're in that moment, it's really hard to say something back. And so that's this question of allyship. And I think that it's an imperfect process, because how do you become a good ally? Because we can't walk in each other's shoes. We don't know what each other's life experiences are. And we all have these unconscious biases. And, you know, the graphic that I put to the very left, white people, this is not the time to join a book club. This actually came out of a book club conversation that we had in the Edmonton Dialogue Studio, where we talked about White Fragility, the book club, or White Fragility, the book. And it was written a few years ago before, you know, Black Lives Matter became a very time-sensitive conversation. But in that context, we had this book club, and I was Googling questions to talk about the book club, and I pulled up an article about how when the going gets tough, the white people form book clubs, and how that's not really allyship. But so I shared this article with the people in the book club, and it led to a pretty passionate argument about, well, how do you become a good ally, and what steps are meaningful to take in supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion, and which ones aren't? And the answer is there isn't any good answers. It's a really hard topic. These are big, challenging societal issues that we're dealing with. And that's why I think it's okay to be imperfect. And it's okay to say, we're going to get this wrong. I'm going to give a talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion to the women in architecture in Vancouver, and I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to say things that upset people, but at least we're talking about it, and at least we're trying to advance the conversation and build awareness. And we're all going to make mistakes while we do it, and it's going to be hard, but unless we do it, nothing is going to change. And so, you know, maybe having a book club isn't the solution to global racial strife, but it's possibly a small step in the right direction. And, you know, maybe you can't be the person that speaks up in your organization when your boss is a sexist pig to your colleague, but can you speak up to someone else in your organization? Can you talk to HR? Can you talk to another partner? Can you start to build support and understanding and tolerance that that is no longer acceptable behavior?
Okay, thank you. There are a couple more questions. No, I'm actually going to pass it on to Kate, so maybe Kate can read some of the questions.
Sure. One question, can you talk more about how an organization can have belonging? E.g., what are some of the good signs?
I think the good signs are when organizations start to ask questions like this. Like, what do we need to do? Hosting events, talks, but also organizations where people feel comfortable to be themselves and where that diversity is celebrated, where different holidays or, you know, that aren't the traditional sort of neo-Christian ones are celebrated, where people feel safe to bring their families, their partners to events and to be their true authentic selves. Like, work is so freaking hard some of the time. You don't need to be worried about not being yourself at your workplace. So I think, you know, a company is heading in the right direction to belonging when you can laugh at work, when you don't have to hide yourself, when you can feel safe to make mistakes, and when you can feel safe to call people out on behavior that's maybe not aligned to sort of your corporate vision or your corporate culture. But it's always going to be a bit of a shifting target because culture, like diversity, equity, and inclusion is so specific to an organization, and we're always working towards improving these goals and these metrics. So I think also, you know, not living in the status quo, but constantly pressing forward and wanting to make change, that's a sign of belonging in an organization. And I know my organization, we're not perfect. It's not great, things are changing. We just undertook a diversity study to look at how we can get more women at the partnership table. We're talking about Black Lives Matter. We're making mistakes, but we're discussing it. We had a national diversity forum, like all, so it's not perfect, but it's going forward. And I think that helps create a space of belonging. And maybe one day we won't have to have all of these conversations, but in the meantime, I want to make sure that there's space for people to feel supported and heard and valued.
Great. How do you incorporate diversity, inclusion, and equity into design, the experience of space?
Oh my goodness, that's a whole other talk. Actually, I have a wonderful colleague in the Vancouver studio, Jennifer Fix, who is a planner who's done a lot of work on this, and she has this wonderful talk called Femopolis about designing cities for women. But I'm a big believer in participatory design, and before I fell in love with learning about diversity, I was in love with learning about participatory design. So I think actually engagement is a big part of that. And I come from a school of thought where the great design comes out of a collaborative process. So asking stakeholders, what do they want in the design of their cities? Making sure you're engaging a variety of voices, not just the 10 typical people that come out to a public event, but who are the populations that don't have a voice at the table? One of the things that I do in my practice when we start public engagement is we write a public engagement plan, and then we say, who are the people that are not at the table in this plan, and how do we go out and engage those people? And oftentimes it means going to those people because, again, typical public engagement hits a very specific demographic, the people that don't have anything to do from 6 to 8 o'clock at night on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday evening. So if you're not one of those people, how do you get engaged in a conversation about a new building, a new public space, a new park? And so I think as designers, it's really important that we ask those kinds of questions and talk to people that are going to use our space. And I think this is, again, my personal bias, but that notion of the sole architectural genius who sits alone in his ivory tower and an act of God gives him a great design idea and he draws it out and then it's finished. Maybe his name is Frank Gehry, maybe it's not. A whole bias there. I think those days are long gone. And I think now that great architecture and great design comes through a collaborative process where many people sit around a table and share a diversity of ideas, and that gets integrated into a final product that reflects the values, aspirations, and goals of the community, the stakeholders in the city that it will serve. Sorry, Kate.
That's sort of a good segue to the next question, which is, if you have a seat at the table, what's a good strategy to help pull others up? I'm guessing they're talking more about in the workplace as opposed to the engagement process. But.
First of all, saying help pull others up is a big part of it. Look behind you and make sure that you're mentoring the people that are following in your footsteps, but also I think exposing them to a huge opportunity. I've been really fortunate in my career to have great mentors, and I try really hard to make space in my life to mentor people who are coming behind me, but also making sure that they are getting perspectives from other people, not just me. So encouraging the people that are on my team that I'm really close to talk to other professionals, partners in the organization, get that diversity of thought, get that diversity of experience, but then just making sure that you really aren't pulling up the rope, you're pulling on the rope and bringing those people with you.
And one last one, so far at least, if the men at the partnership level say they are open to change, what is a good first step to enact change?
That's going to be organizational specific, but can you then say, well, you're open to change. Can we set a target for improving our staff demographics? Can we set a target for that we're going to promote X number of people of color or X number of women, or set a target that we're going to all take diversity, equity, and inclusion training together, or we're going to have someone come in and talk about unconscious bias at a lunch and learn. I think that we probably don't need any more lunch and learns on building envelope or the newest glazing system or whatever the spray park supplier has in their catalog this year. But could we have a lunch and learn on diversity or, you know, phrases to use or not use in the workplace or unconscious bias? Those would all be good targets that you could suggest.
I guess I feel like keeping the conversation continually going is really important, that people don't just say, okay, we've had our lunch and learn on that, we're done.
Yeah.
But making sure, so being persistent.
Well, and on that note, you know, I put in that slide at the beginning, the dial up my feminist agenda. And when the partner in question said that to me, a very senior person in our organization, I was devastated because it was in the context of me participating in a partnership initiative, and I was brand new to the partnership table. But instead, I've made it my badge of honor. Yeah, okay, so I have a feminist agenda. Well, you're going to listen to me because it's not a feminist agenda, it's a humanist agenda, and it's about creating equity. And if I'm going to be labeled like that, I'm going to take what was meant to be a barb and turn it into an attribute and shine the light on that so that everyone is forced to look at it. And that was a really hard thing to do, but I think, you know, it's important. And sometimes it's always unfair that the people without the privilege, the disadvantaged populations, have to do more of the heavy lifting. But until the world is an equitable place, that's just a fact. And so we're going to have to work harder and get our elbows up and get those seats at the table, and then make it easier for the women, the diverse populations that are coming behind us.
Thank you, Jill. And I just want to say something that in the chat, meanwhile, there were a lot of good notes, like thank yous, the information is very helpful and all of that. And I believe there's a question from Karina, Kate, the long question in the chat.
Yeah, it's now in the Q&A as well. And it says, I think that in any organization, when you're trying to include and listen to what everyone thinks, things sometimes can take longer. Being from a different country, even from a different province, the way things happen are at a different speed. And that's when people become impatient because they need to adapt to different ways of thinking and practice these diversity and inclusion and show others they belong and their voice is important. What do you think of that?
I think that's really true. I think it's really hard to be patient, and you know, we want change right away. And if you're at the receiving end of discrimination, it sucks, and you want that change to happen. When I look back in my career at Dialogue, like sometimes I get frustrated that the firm isn't changing fast enough, but then I look back and think, holy cow, we've come a really far way in a really short amount of time. So sometimes a mindfulness practice to stop and say, okay, this is where I am and this is where I've been, and we've actually come pretty far, is valuable. And I think the second piece to that is finding those kindred spirits in your organization that you can go and have a glass of wine with, or a coffee, or whatever fits in your world, that you have someone to have a safe space where you can, you know, complain a little bit about the injustice of the world, but also support and encourage each other to keep the fight up and go forward.
The next one.
Oh,
sorry. How to speak up about things concerning you, unconscious discrimination, not feeling included, not being given equal opportunities at the office without being labeled as a problematic / demanding / non-flexible one.
$1 million question. When I started work, I used to joke that there were two types of women in an organization: the Bettys and the bitches. So So the Bettys did exactly what they were told, and the bitches were women that didn't do that. And it still, I think, feels like those stereotypes exist. You're either a problematic complainer or you just follow along. It's really hard to be a problematic complainer, but I'd rather sometimes be the squeaky wheel that makes the change. And I think sometimes you have to speak up and not be afraid to be seen as that difficult person. I think you have to choose your moment and your audience wisely and be really strategic. But again, finding those allies, the support, whether it's HR, whether it's a different partner, whether it's an associate, whether it's a colleague, who can support you in that conversation. And then at a certain point, you have to say, you know what, maybe this isn't the right fit because this firm doesn't value me. They do think I'm this disruptive, cranky person, and they don't see the positive aspects. But I always say, if I'm going to get in trouble at dialogue, and I get in trouble all the time, I'd rather get in trouble for making waves than just sitting on the fence. And that's not always an easy position, but that's sort of my personal philosophy is I'd rather be the person that is that squeaky wheel and makes the waves and deals with the consequences than suffering in silence. But it's hard. It's definitely hard.
I get the sense you have more of a presentation you're wanting to go back to.
This is actually the last slide.
Oh.
So it may be a good moment to end on because it's about justice. And again, this is Brian Lee, who's an architect at Design Justice. And he says that justice is to make whole in the present, repair for past injustice, and move barriers to progress in the future. So I think ultimately, this is the goal of a diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, is to remove barriers for progress in the future, but to also acknowledge that the wrongs that have happened in the past. So maybe that's a little bit of the extending your hand to those who are coming behind you, but also advancing forward. And, without consideration of all three aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it'll be really hard to get to this place of justice. So that was sort of my last thought.
Wonderful. Thank you. And
then I have
I found myself nodding my head a lot. Go ahead, Kimia.
There's one more question that's open. Shall I read it?
Sure.
How do you put in practice IDE in, I think we talked about that. You said your colleague would be better, but in the design, in small public projects is sometimes difficult to get an input from users of the buildings, and the only input we get is from planners and maintenance crew.
Oh, this is a good question. My favorite answer to this question is obviously the best, and I'm going to talk about it in the context of landscape architecture, but the best public realm projects are designed to make the guy who shovels the snow or drives the bus's life easier. Like, obviously we have to consider F&M and operations in the design, but that shouldn't be driving the design decisions that we make. No great cities or no great buildings were ever built to make the maintenance guy's job easy. In small scale projects, I think we really need to help educate and advocate to our clients the importance of engaging with end users, with stakeholders, whomever they are. And obviously that's hard because sometimes, we all have clients and they may not necessarily want to pay us for that. But one of the things I try to help the clients do is see the value that spending a little bit more time up front will actually save them on some of those operational costs down the road. And, sometimes the people that we want to engage don't exist. We're just finishing a park in Edmonton in a very challenged part of the downtown. And the park is actually the first major project in an urban renewal strategy. So there are no residential populations to engage in what they wanted to see in the program of the park. So instead, we went out to all of the social agencies that are in the neighborhood. We talked to nearby schools. We talked to people who might want to move there. Like, it was a lot of going out and finding the stakeholders and talking to them. We can't always expect that people come to us. But I really have seen that by putting a huge amount of effort in, and it's not even a huge amount, just putting effort in at the beginning stages of a design process to try to understand those end users, and to design those spaces with social equity pays off in the long run. And I think it's part of our job as designers to help educate our clients on the value of that process. And if all else fails, I never say social equity to clients. I say, this will save you money. There will be less change orders. And that seems to help a lot.
That was very, very nice, Jill. Very informative. Lots of new things to learn and to, well, remind ourselves to practice. Thank you very much. I believe everybody is saying the same. I'm not sure if you're reading the chat, but somebody actually said, thanks for being an awesome colleague and for moving this conversation. Gail has said that. There's lots of people thanking you. So.
Well, and I want to read one. Thank you so much. Good for you being the one making the waves. Not an easy position to take, but I do agree that it's more fulfilling than internalizing it all the time. Which is a great.
I can't see the chat, but I very much appreciate those comments. So thank you for being such a great audience. And I didn't have it at the beginning. I guess I should have put it at the end. I have my contact information here. So if anyone has questions or wants a follow-up conversation or a virtual coffee, don't hesitate to reach out, because I love talking about this and I love supporting women as we come together to change the world.
And I want to thank Kimya for helping out as well. I didn't introduce you at the beginning. And to all attending. And I do want to remind anybody who hasn't already done so, if you want AIBC learning units, to make sure you put your name and email address in the chat. And stay posted for future WIA events. And again, if you want the email to get the notices on them, make sure that you sign up for the email list. Thank you very much. I pasted
all the links that you can use that Karina had sent throughout the chat for all the WIA platforms. Keep posted.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Jill.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye.